This is a reading of Terry Pratchett's Mort, a novel in the Discworld series. A disclaimer: I am not a native English speaker, and this, as a fantasy novel, has names and locations that might have a different pronunciation than what I think. I will pronounce things as how I think they are pronounced, although that might not be correct. This is the bright candlelit room where the life-timers are stored, shelf upon shelf of them, squat hourglasses, one for every living person, pouring their fine sand from the future into the past. The accumulated hiss of the falling grains makes the room roar like the sea. This is the owner of the room, stalking through it with a preoccupied air. His name is Death. But not any death. This is the Death whose particular sphere of operations is, well, not a sphere at all, but the Discworld, which is flat and rides on the back of 4 giant elephants who stand on the shell of the enormous star turtle Qa'Rajh, and which is bounded by a waterfall that cascades endlessly into space. Scientists have calculated that the chance of anything so patently absurd actually existing are millions to one. But magicians have calculated that 1,000,000 to 1 chances crop up 9 times out of 10. Death clicks across the black and white tiled floor on toes of bone, muttering inside his cowl as his skeletal fingers count along the rows of busy hourglasses. Finally, he finds one that seems to satisfy him, lifts it carefully from its shelf, and carries it across to the nearest candle. He holds it so that the light glints off of it and stares at the little point of reflected brilliance. The steady gaze from whose twinkling eye sockets encompasses the world turtle, sculling through the deeps of space, carapace scarred by comets and pitted by meteors. One day, great Qa'Rajh will die, Death knows. Now that would be a challenge. But the focus of his gaze dives onwards toward the blue-green magnificence of the disk itself, turning slowly under its tiny orbiting sun. Now it curves away towards the great mountain range called the Ram Tops. The Ram Tops are full of deep valleys and unexpected crags, and considerably more geography than they know what to do with. They have their own peculiar weather full of shrapnel rain and whiplash winds and permanent thunderstorms. Some people say it's all because the Ram Tops are the home of old and wild magic. Mind you, some people will say anything. Death blinks, adjusts for depth of vision. Now he sees the grassy country on the turn-white slopes of the mountains. Now he sees a particular hillside. Now he sees a field. Now he sees a boy running. Now he watches. Now, in a voice like lead slabs being dropped on granite, he says, "Yes." There was no doubt that there was something magical in the soil of that hilly broken area which, because of the strange tint that it gave to the local flora, was known as the Octarine Grass Country. For example, it was one of the few places on the Discworld where plants produced reannual plants. Reannuals are plants that grow backwards in time. You sow the seed this year and they grow last year. Mort's family specialized in distilling the wine from reannual grapes. These were very powerful and much sought after by fortune tellers, since, of course, they enabled them to see the future. The only snag was that you got the hangover the morning before and had to drink a lot of it to get over it. Reannual growers tended to be big, serious men, much given to introspection and close examination of the calendar. A farmer who neglects to sow ordinary seeds only loses the crop, whereas anyone who forgets to sow seeds of a crop that has already been harvested 12 months before risks disturbing the entire fabric of casuality, not to mention acute embarrassment. It was so acutely embarrassing to Mort's family that the youngest son was not at all serious and had about the same talent for horticulture that you would find in a dead starfish. It wasn't that he was unhelpful, but he had the kind of vague, cheerful helpfulness that serious men soon learn to dread. There was something infectious, possibly even fatal, about it. He was tall, red-haired, freckled, with a sort of body that seems to be only marginally under his owner's control. It appeared to have been built entirely out of knees. On this particular day it was hurtling across the high fields, waving its hands and yelling. Mort's father and uncle watched it disconsolately from the stone wall. "What I don't understand," said Father Lessig, "is that the birds don't even fly away. I'd fly away if I saw that thing coming towards me." The human body is a wonderful thing. I mean, his legs go all over the place, but there's a fair turn of speed there. Mort reached the end of a furrow. An overfull wood pigeon lurched slowly out of his way. "His heart is in the right place, mind," said Lessig carefully. Of course. It's the rest of him that isn't." "He's clean about the house. Doesn't eat much," said Lessig. "No, I can see that." Lessig looked sideways at his brother, who was staring fixedly at the sky. "I did hear you got the place going up at your farm, Hamish," he said. Got an apprentice in, didn't I?" Said Lessig gloomily. "When was that, then?" "Yesterday," said his brother, lying with rattlesnake speed. "All signed and sealed, sorry. Look, I got nothing against young Mort, see. He's as nice a boy as you could wish to meet. It's just that—" I know, said Lessig. "He couldn't find his arse with both hands." They stared at the distant figure. It had fallen over. Some pigeons had waddled over to inspect it. "He's not stupid, mind," said Hamish. "Not what you'd call stupid." "There's a brain in there, all right," Lessig conceded. "Sometimes he starts thinking so hard you has to hit him round the head to get his attention. His granny taught him to read, see? I reckon it overheated his mind." Mort got up and tripped over his robe. "You ought to set him to a trade," said Hamish, reflectively. "The priesthood, maybe, or wizardry. They do a lot of reading, wizards." They looked at each other. Into both their minds stole an inkling of what Mort might be capable of, or might be capable of if he got his well-meaning hands on a book of magic. "All right," said Hamish hurriedly. "Something else, then. There must be lots of things he could turn his hand to." "He starts thinking too much, that's the trouble," said Lessig. "Look at him now. You don't think about how to scare birds, you just does it. A normal boy, I mean." Hamish scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Could be someone else's problem," he said. Lessig's expression did not alter, but there was a subtle change around his eyes. "What do you mean?" he said. There's a hiring fair at Sheepridge next week. You set him as an apprentice, see, and his new master'll have the job of knocking him into shape. That's the law. Get him indentured, and that's binding." Lessig looked across the field at his son, who was examining a rock. "I wouldn't want anything to happen to him, mind," he said doubtfully. "We're quite fond of him, his mother and me. You get used to people. It'll be for his own good, you'll see. Make a man of him." Well, there's certainly plenty of raw material," sighed Lessig. Mort was getting interested in the rock. It had curly shells in it, relics of the early days of the world when the Creator had made creatures out of stone, and no one knew exactly why. Mort was interested in a lot of things. Why people's teeth fitted together so neatly, for example. He'd given that one a lot of thought. Then there was the puzzle of why the sun came out during the day instead of at night when the light would come in useful. He knew the standard explanation, which somehow didn't seem satisfying to him. In short, Mort was one of those people who are more dangerous than a bag full of rattlesnakes. He was determined to discover the underlying logic behind the universe. Which was going to be hard because there wasn't one. The Creator had a lot of remarkably good ideas when he put the world together, but making it understandable had not been one of them. Tragic heroes always moan when the gods take an interest in them, but it's the people the gods ignore who really gets the tough deals. His father was yelling at him, as usual. Mort threw the rock at a pigeon, which was almost too full to lurch out of the way, and wandered back across the field. And that was why Mort and his father walked down through the mountains into Sheepridge on Hogswatch Eve with Mort's rather sparse possessions in a sack on the back of a donkey. The town was much more than 4 sides to a coupled square, lined with shops that provided all the service industry of the farming community. After 5 minutes, Mort came out of the tailor's wearing a loose-fitting brown garment of imprecise function which had been understandably unclaimed by a previous owner and had plenty of room for him to grow, on the assumption that he would actually grow into a 19-legged elephant. His father regarded him critically. "Very nice," he said. "For the money." "It itches," said Mort. "I think there's things in here with me. There's thousands of lads in the world who would be very thankful for a nice warm..." Lizzie paused and gave up. "Garment like that, lad." "I could share it with them," Mort said hopefully. "You got to look smart," said Lessig severely. "You got to make an impression, stand out in the crowd." There was no doubt about it. He would. They set out among the throng crowding the square, each listening to his own thoughts. Usually Mort enjoyed visiting the town with its cosmopolitan atmosphere and strange dialects from villages as far away as 5 or perhaps even 10 miles. But this time he felt unpleasantly apprehensive, as if he could remember something that hadn't happened yet. The fair seemed to work like this. Men looking for work stood in ragged lines in the center of the square. Many of them sported little symbols in their hats to tell the world what kind of work they were trained in. Shepherds wore a wisp of wool, carters a hank of horsehair, interior decorators a strip of rather interesting Hessian wall covering, and so on. The boys seeking apprenticeship were clustered on the hub side of the square. "You just go and stand there, and someone comes and offers you an apprenticeship," said Lessig, his voice trimmed with uncertainty. "If they like the look of you, that is." "How do they do that?" said Mort. "Well," said Lessig, and paused. Hamish hadn't exactly explained this bit. He drew on his limited knowledge of the marketplace, which was restricted to livestock sales, and ventured, "I suppose they count your teeth and that, and make sure you don't wheeze and your feet are all right. I shouldn't let on about the reading. It unsettles people." "And then what?" said Mort. "Then you go and learn a trade," said Lessig. "What trade in particular?" "Well, carpentry's a good one," Lessig hazarded. "Or theory. Someone's got to do it." Mort looked at his feet. He was a dutiful son, when he remembered, and if being an apprentice was what was expected of him, then he was determined to be a good one. Carpentry didn't sound very promising, though. Wood had a stubborn life of its own and a tendency to split. Unofficial thieves were rare in the ram-tops, where people weren't rich enough to afford them. "All right," he said eventually. "I'll go and give it a try, but what happens if I don't get apprenticed?" Lessig scratched his head. I don't know," he said. "I expect you just wait until the end of the fair. At midnight, I suppose." And now midnight approached. A light frost began to crisp the cobblestones. In the ornamental clock tower that overlooked the square, a couple of delicately carved little automatons whirred out of trapdoors on the clock face and struck the quarter hour. 15 minutes to midnight. Mort shivered, but the crimson fires of shame and stubbornness flared up inside him, hotter than the slopes of hell. He blew on his fingers for something to do and stared up at the freezing sky, trying to avoid the stares of the few stragglers among what remained of the fair. Most of the stall-keepers had already packed up and gone. Even the hot meat-pie man had stopped crying his wares and, with no regard for personal safety, was eating one. The last of Mort's fellow hopefuls had vanished hours ago. He was a wall-eyed young man with a stoop and a running nose, and Sheepridge's own licensed beggar had pronounced him to be ideal material. The lad on the other side of Mort had gone off to be a toy-maker. One by one they had trooped off. The masons, the farriers, the assassins, the mercers, coopers, hoodwinkers, and ploughmen. In a few minutes it would be the new year, and 100 boys would be starting out hopefully on their careers, new, worthwhile lives of useful service rolling out in front of them. Mort wondered miserably why he hadn't been picked. He tried to look respectable and had looked all prospective masters squarely in the eye to impress them with his excellent nature and extremely likable qualities. This didn't seem to have the right effect. "Would you like some hot meat pie?" said his father. "No." "He's selling them cheap." "No." "Thank you." "Oh." Lessig hesitated. "I could ask the man if he wants an apprentice," he said, helpfully. "Very reliable, the catering trade." "I don't think he does," said Mort. "No, probably not," said Lessig. "Bit of a one-man business, I expect. He's gone now, anyway. Tell you what, I'll save you a bit of mine." "I don't actually feel very hungry, Dad." "There's hardly any gristle." "No, but thanks all the same." "Oh." Leszek deflated a little. He danced about a bit to stamp some life back into his feet, and whistled a few tuneless bars between his teeth. He felt he ought to say something, to offer some kind of advice, to point out that life had its ups and downs, and to put his arm around his son's shoulder and talk expansively about the problems of growing up, to indicate, in short, that the world is a funny old place where one should never, metaphorically speaking, be so proud as to turn down the offer of a perfectly good hot meat pie. They were alone now. The frost, the last one of the year, tightened its grip on the stones. High in the tower above them, a cogged wheel went clonk, tripped a lever, released a ratchet, and let a heavy lead weight drop down. There was a dreadful metallic wheezing noise, and the trapdoors in the clock face slid open, releasing the clockwork men. Swinging the hammers jerkily, as if they were afflicted with robotic arthritis, they began to ring the new day in. "Well, that's it," said Leszek, hopefully. They had to find somewhere to sleep. Hogwatch night was no time to be walking in the mountains. Perhaps there was a stable somewhere. "It's not midnight until the last stroke," said Mort distantly. Leszek shrugged. The sheer strength of Mort's obstinacy was defeating him. "All right," he said. "We'll wait." And then they heard the clip-clop of hooves, which boomed rather more loudly around the chilly square than common acoustics should really allow for. In fact, clip-clop was an astonishingly inaccurate word for the kind of noise which rattled around Mort's head. Clip-clop suggested a rather jolly little pony, quite possibly wearing a straw hat with holes cut out for its ears. An edge to this sound made it very clear that straw hats was not an option. The horse entered the square by the hop road, steam curling off its huge, damp, white flanks, and sparks striking up from the cobbles beneath it. It trotted proudly, like a war charger. It was definitely not wearing a straw hat. The tall figure on its back was wrapped up against the cold. When the horse reached the center of the square, the rider dismounted slowly and fumbled with something behind the saddle. Eventually, he, or perhaps she, produced a nose bag, fastened it over the horse's ears, and gave it a friendly pat on the neck. The air took on a thick, greasy feel, and the deep shadows around Mort became edged with blue and purple rainbows. The rider strode towards him, black cloak billowing and feet making little clicking sounds on the cobbles. They were the only noises. Silence clamped down on the square like great drifts of cotton wool. The impressive effect was rather spoiled by a patch of ice. "Oh, bugger!" It wasn't exactly a voice. The words were there, all right, but they arrived in Mort's head without bothering to pass through his ears. He rushed forward to help the fallen figure and found himself grappling a hold of a hand that was nothing more than polished bone, smooth and rather yellowed like an old billiard ball. The figure's hood fell back, and a naked skull turned its empty eye sockets toward him. Not quite empty, though. Deep within them, as though they were windows looking across the gulfs of space, were two tiny blue stars. It occurred to Mort that he ought to feel horrified, so he was slightly shocked to find that he wasn't. It was a skeleton sitting in front of him, rubbing its knees and grumbling, but it was a live one, curiously impressive, but not, for some strange reason, very frightening. "Thank you, boy," said the skull. "What is your name?" Said Mort. "Mortimer, sir. They call me Mort." "What a coincidence," said the skull. "Help me up, please." The figure rose unsteadily, brushing itself down. Now Mort could see there was a heavy belt around its waist, from which was slung a white-handled sword. "I hope you're not hurt, sir," he said politely. The skull grinned. Of course, Mort thought, it hasn't got much of a choice. "No harm done, I'm sure." The skull looked around and seemed to see Leszek, who appeared to be frozen to the spot for the first time. Mort thought an explanation was called for. "My father," he said, trying to move more protectively in front of Exhibit A without causing any offense. "Excuse me, sir, but are you deaf?" "Correct. Full marks for observation, that boy." Mort swallowed. "My father is a good man," he said. He thought for a while and added, "Quite good. I'd rather you left him alone, if it's all the same to you. I don't know what you've done to him, but I'd like you to stop it now. No offense meant." Death stepped back, his skull on one side. I have merely put us outside time for a moment, he said. He will see and hear nothing that disturbs him. No, boy, it was you I came for. Me? You are here seeking employment. Light dawned on Mort. You are looking for an apprentice, he said. The eye sockets turned towards him, the actinic pinpoints flaring. Of course. Death waved a bony hand. There was a wash of purple light, a sort of visible pop, and Lessig unfroze. Above his head, the clockwork automatons got on with the job of proclaiming midnight as time was allowed once more to come creeping back. Lessig blinked. I didn't see you there for a minute, he said. Sorry, mine must have been elsewhere. I was offering your boy a position, said Death. I trust that meets with your approval. What was your job again, said Lessig, talking to a black-robed skeleton without showing even a flicker of surprise. I usher souls into the next world, said Death. Ah, said Lessig. Of course. Sorry, should have guessed from the clothes. Very necessary work, very steady. Established business. I have been going for some time, yes, said Death. Good. Never really thought of it as a job for Mort, but you know. But it's good work, always very reliable. What's your name? Death. Dad, Mort said urgently. I can't say I recognize the firm, said Lessig. Where are you based exactly? From the uttermost depth of the sea to the heights where even the eagle may not go, said Death. That's fair enough, nodded Lessig. Well, Dad, said Mort, pulling at his father's coat. Death laid a hand on Mort's shoulder. What your father sees and hears is not what you see and hear, he said. Do not worry him. Do you think he would want to see me in the flesh, as it were? But you're Death, said Mort. You go around killing people. I kill? Said Death, obviously offended. Certainly not. People get killed, but that's their business. I just take over from then on. After all, it'll be a bloody stupid world if people got killed without dying, wouldn't it? Well, yeah, said Mort doubtfully. Mort had never heard the word intrigued. It was not regular use in family vocabulary, but a spark in his soul told him that here was something weird and fascinating and not entirely horrible, and that if he let this moment go, he'd spend the rest of his life regretting it. And he remembered the humiliations of the day and the long walk that was waiting him to get back home. He began, I don't have to die to get the job, do I? Being dead is not compulsory. And, the bones? Not if you don't want to. Mort breathed out again. It had been starting to prey on his mind. Father says it's all right, he said. He looked at Lessig, who was scratching his beard. How do you feel about this, Mort? With a brittle brightness of a fever victim. It's not everyone's idea of an occupation. It's certainly not what I had in mind, I'd admit. But they do say that undertaking is an honoured profession. It's your choice. Undertaking? Said Mort. Death nodded and raised his finger to his lips in a conspiratorial gesture. It's interesting, Mort said slowly. I think I'd like to try it. Where did you say your business was? Said Lessig. Is it far? No further than the thickness of a shadow, said Death. Where the first primal cell was, there was I also. Where man is, there I am. When the last life crawls on the freezing stars, there I will be. Ah, said Lessig, you get about a bit then. He looked puzzled, like a man struggling to remember something important, and then obviously gave up. Death patted him on the shoulder in a friendly fashion and turned to Mort. Have you any possessions, boy? Yes, said Mort, and then remembered. Only, I think I left them in the shop. Dad, we left the sack in the clothes shop. That'll be shot, said Lessig. Shops don't open on Hawk's Watch Day. I have to go back the day after tomorrow. Well, tomorrow now. It is of little account, said Death. We will leave now. No doubt I will have business here soon enough. I hope you'll be able to drop in and see us soon, said Lessig. He seemed to be struggling with his thoughts. I'm not sure that will be a good idea, said Mort. Well, goodbye, lad, said Lessig. You have to do what you're told, understand? And, excuse me, sir, do you have a son? Death looked rather taken aback. No, he said. I have no sons. I'll just have a last word with my boy, if you have no objection. Then I will go and see to the horse, said Death, with a more than normal tact. Lessig put his arm around his son's shoulders with some difficulty in view of the difference in height, and gently propelled him across the square. Mort, you know how your uncle Hamish told me about this apprenticing business, he whispered. Yes? Well, he told me something else, the old man confided. He said it's not unknown for an apprentice to inherit his master's business. What do you think of that, then? I'm not sure, said Mort. It's worth thinking about, said Lessig. I am thinking about it, father. Many a young lad has started out that way, Hamish said. He makes himself useful, earns his master's confidence, and, well, if there's any daughters in the house, did, Mr. say anything about daughters? Mr. who? Said Mort. Mr. your new master. Oh, him? No. No, I don't think so, said Mort, slowly. I don't think he's the marrying type. And many a keen young man owes his advancement to his nuptials, said Lessig. He does? Mort, I don't think you're really listening. What? Lessig came to a halt on the frosty cobbles and spun the boy around to face him. You're really going to have to do better than this, he said. Don't you understand, boy? If you're going to amount to anything in this world, then you got to listen. I'm your father telling you these things. Mort looked down at his father's face. He wanted to say a lot of things. He wanted to say how much he loved him, how worried he was. He wanted to ask what his father really thought he'd just seen or heard. He wanted to say that he felt as though he stepped on a molehill and found that it was really, in fact, a volcano. He wanted to ask what nuptials meant. What he actually says was, Yes, thank you. I'd better be going. I'll try and write you a letter. There's bound to be someone passing who can read it to us, said Lizzie. Goodbye, Mort. He blew his nose. Goodbye, Dad. I'll come back to visit, said Mort. Death coughed tactfully, although it sounded like the pistol crack of an ancient beam full of Death Watch beetle. We had better be going, he said. Hop up, Mort. As Mort scrambled behind the ornate silver saddle, Death leaned down and shook Lessig's hand. Thank you, he said. He's a good lad at heart, said Lessig. A bit dreamy, that's all. I suppose we're all young ones. Death considered this. No, he said. I don't think so. He gathered up the reins and turned the horse towards the rim road. From his perch behind the black-robed figure, Mort waved desperately. Lessig waved back. Then, as the horse and his two riders disappeared from view, he lowered his hand and looked at it. The handshake. It had felt strange, but somehow he couldn't exactly remember why.